In comics, there are a bunch of different stories and ideas that are often frequently debated. However, to me, I feel like one thing that is often very much so argued upon by the greater comic community is a concept in which we talk about Mount Rushmore characters, and even more specifically, a post I saw the other day, which did talk about how the Mount Rushmore for superhero characters is very much so not debatable. And I personally could not disagree with that more because I can think of multiple characters you could have on the Mount Rushmore for superheroes and realistically be able to argue and support multiple characters being on that Mount Rushmore. But that being said, that's why today we're talking superhero Mount Rushmore. Debate is over. But before we get into anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. All right, superhero Mount Rushmore. First and foremost, let's get the easy ones out of the way. We obviously know Superman is taking one of those four spots. He is the superhero of superheroes, one of the most popular superheroes in comics, animation, live action. So he is obviously up there, and joining him is his DC buddy, Batman, for pretty much the same reasons. Batman is the most iconic character aside from Superman, and even when you compare him to Superman, a lot of people would say Batman is more iconic than Superman is, even though Superman is the prototypical superhero. That being said, the third spot is probably the easiest spot. It is Spider-Man. He routinely outsells the likes of Batman and Superman and has even outsold both of them at the same time. Not to mention the myriad of different animated series we've got for this character, all of the different comic runs, the merchandise, video games, and the overall impact this character has had on the superhero genre. So those three spots are locked, and I feel like if you debate those three being on this Mount Rushmore, you probably have not read comics, because why would you not have those three up there? That being said, the fourth one is where it gets a little more interesting, and that's the one in which there is so much debate. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to list off 5 characters that could take that final spot on the Mount Rushmore of superhero characters. Now, just because I name these 5 characters does not believe I personally believe they deserve that spot. I will save that honor for the character that I name number 1, as I do have these in a particular order. However, that being said, the character I have in the number 2 slot, I would never argue with anyone who has this character above the character I put in the 4th slot, just because the number 2 character essentially has every positive argument that I could give for my number 1 spot. It truly is just personal preference at that point, because I do believe both of these characters contribute to comics in a very similar way. With that being said, I do have a couple of honorable mentions as well. These would be characters that I would personally disagree with. However, I could at least see how people would want to put these said characters on this Mount Rushmore. So first and foremost, for the honorable mentions, I have Green Lantern. Now for this, I don't have a particular Green Lantern in mind, just the overall character of Green Lantern, because of how big his legacy has been, starting out with Hal Jordan, moving on to John Stewart, Guy Gardner, Kyle Rayner, Jessica Cruz. It is undeniable the impact the character of Green Lantern has had. However, that being said, I personally don't believe this character belongs in that 4th slot on the Mount Rushmore, just because I don't think the popularity is really there for the general audience as much so as it is for these other characters. And that much is pretty apparent for the next entry on this list, and that is the character of The Flash. Now, the CW TV show definitely helped bolster and ignite the passion fans have for this character, bringing to the forefront Barry Allen, as a lot of people were used to Wally West, myself included, growing up with the DCAU. Wally West was always my Flash. However, being introduced to Barry Allen and getting to learn his story in that show, and then also with the DCAMU, having Barry Allen being the main version of the Flash, and then the New 52 run in the comics, propelling Barry Allen once again to be the main Flash, I could definitely see why people would want the Flash to be this 4th spot, especially if you don't just count the character of Barry Allen, but you count the Flash as a mantle, because it does get passed down to Wally West and other characters throughout time. And while that is true, I would still personally disagree with this, just because I do not believe Flash comics in particular do as well as the other ones on this list. And not only that, there haven't really been that many Flash oriented stories in live action or animation if we're talking about a movie dedicated to just that character. Flashpoint was a movie that did have Barry Allen as the title character. However, aside from that and the live action Flash movie, we really didn't get anything from this character. He was more so a supporting character, which is definitely fine. However, it definitely lessens the impact of this character. Speaking of lessening the impact of a character, we have our final honorable mention, and that is Iron Man. Yes, Iron Man, thanks to the MCU, has become one of the most popular superheroes, a very much so beloved character. However, we cannot forget that this was realistically a C or B list hero before the MCU was around. The Avengers was not the A team, no matter what anyone says. The A team in Marvel was always the X-Men, followed by the Fantastic Four. Avengers was always third at best. So that being said, because of that, if you take out the MCU, Iron Man does not have that much ground to stand on, and his comics don't do that well from a selling standpoint. His merchandise, thanks to the MCU, does do fairly well. He has had multiple animated series, one of which was absolutely awesome, had that amazing theme song. The very unique animation style, Iron Man Armored Adventures, was a very enjoyable series, brought us a new take on the character. However, I don't think that's enough to justify putting him on this list of Mount Rushmore characters. But with all the honorable mentions out of the way, let's get into our top 5 on the characters that could take that final Mount Rushmore spot. And coming in at number 5, we have the Incredible Hulk. Now look, listen, if we're talking about a character who has been around for a while, who has introduced other comic book characters through their own comic books, and who has also had a major impact, not only in movies, but also through television, as the Hulk has had multiple different TV shows, had appearances in multiple TV shows throughout the years, whether they are animated or live action, and even having his own game. This character is incredibly iconic. So if someone were to put the Incredible Hulk on their personal Mount Rushmore, I would definitely understand it. However, I would also dispute it, as the Hulk isn't the leader of his team. The Hulk's merchandise, when compared to other characters, isn't that great. It's actually not that stellar at all. We will probably never get a live action Hulk movie again, especially not a solo one. So that definitely hurts this character being on the Mount Rushmore if you can't even have a solo film. Now, is that the character's fault? No, that is the studio's fault. However, still, it is going to hurt this character's chances of being on the Mount Rushmore. However, that being said, he did still introduce one of the other most iconic characters, and that actually brings me to my number 4 entry on this list, and that is Wolverine. Now look, listen, I know the leader of the X-Men is Cyclops. My favorite X-Man is Cyclops. That being said, I cannot deny that the most iconic character from the X-Men universe, aside from Magneto, and if we're talking just about on the hero side, it is Wolverine, without a doubt. And yes, I know he wasn't originally created to be a member of the X-Men. It was just an evolution that happened over time. However, it is no coincidence that when you think about the X-Men, probably one of the 2 or 3 characters you think about first is, without a doubt, Wolverine, especially if you are only talking about the good guys. Not only that, this is a character who often headlines video games. In the Ultimate Alliance games, Wolverine was one of the main characters you could play as. He is also getting his own video game that comes out, I believe, later this year or next year. He was the main character of the Fox X-Men movies. Was that a good decision? In my opinion, no, but that's as a Cyclops fan. And if you have Hugh Jackman as Wolverine, it definitely makes sense if you want to make him the main character. And this isn't the first time they have done this. There was a series called Wolverine and the X-Men, and although it only got 1 season, it was still fairly popular, and in my opinion, it was a very enjoyable series, and it showed us how Wolverine would be as the leader of the X-Men. And he was a very competent leader. He was a very compelling character to watch as the leader of the X-Men. So with all that being said, that's why I have Wolverine above Hulk, just because I feel like he definitely has had more of an impact on the greater landscape of the comic book world. But if we're talking about greater landscapes of the comic book world, we cannot forget to mention this number 3 entry on the list, and that is Captain America. Yes, America's champion, America's hero, the first Avenger. He is without a doubt gotten more popularity thanks to the MCU. However, one of the reasons that I have him above Iron Man is because while I would typically say Iron Man is C or B list in the comics, I would say Captain America is B to A list. And the reasons being, he is traditionally the leader of the Avengers. And not only that, he also crosses over with some other iconic characters, having interactions that dwarf most of the interactions that Iron Man has. And one of those relationships and interactions that Captain America has is with the character of Wolverine. Their relationship, thanks to everything that happened during World War II, and their interactions in the comics, even in present day, that call back to that time, were absolutely amazing and did so much for the comic community and definitely tied things back to that time of the World War II era. Now, not just seeing it through the guise of a soldier or through the guise of a mutant, but how both of those come together. And he was a very instrumental character in very big comic storylines like the Civil War comic, where he was very much so the main character. He also has arguably the best trilogy in the MCU. So if we're going to talk about how Iron Man was propelled to the forefront thanks to the MCU, we can't forget to add Captain America to that list. And not only that, Captain America, from a merchandise and comic sales standpoint, actually outsells the Hulk, Iron Man, and even the likes of Wolverine, if we're not talking about X-Men as a whole, but just Wolverine as a character. So because of all of that, I have to put Captain America above the other two, and I would not really be able to refute that much if people decide to have Captain America as their number 4 entry on their Mount Rushmore of superheroes. However, with that being said, our number 2 spot is one that I have absolutely no argument against. I absolutely would agree if anyone decided to put this character on their number 4 spot for Mount Rushmore superheroes. But with that being said, I do still have them only at number 2, and that is Wonder Woman. Yes, I know, before you freak out, let me just explain. First and foremost, why I believe Wonder Woman doesn't really have many arguments to not be in that final Mount Rushmore spot. She was quite literally the blueprint for female superheroes. She was the first female superhero to get her own comic title. I did a lot of research and I did find that she was the first female superhero to have a comic run titled from her. There were other female characters that did appear before her. However, she was the first one to get her own actual comic run, and it did do very well. And in fact, Wonder Woman comics have continued to do very well throughout the years. And not only that, she also has had fairly successful live action debuts as well. And not only that, she also is part of the DC Trinity, part of the Justice League, one of, if not the most popular superhero teams we have in comics, rivaling the likes of the X-Men. So with all that being said, it definitely makes sense why people would have Wonder Woman up this high, and they would put her in that 4th slot. And not only has she thrived in live action movies and animated projects, some of her animated movies are some of the absolute best we have gotten from DC, period. The Wonder Woman movie from either 2007 or 2009, where she does face off against Ares, the story is very much so similar to the live action Wonder Woman we got, except in my opinion, it's way better. It is animated, so obviously you get way better fights. However, the story is just told in a much more compelling way. There are characters you care way more about. The stakes feel even higher than they did in that first Wonder Woman movie. However, not a lot of people talk about that movie. I'm not really sure why. If you haven't seen it, go check it out. It's really enjoyable. Great watch. But even with all that being said, and even with how popular this character is from a merchandise standpoint and how influential this character has been in comics, I do believe there is a character that has had slightly more influence, that is even slightly more recognizable than Wonder Woman. And that brings me to number 1 on my list, who I have in my 4th slot on the Mount Rushmore of superheroes, and that is none other than Dick Grayson, Robin. Yes, I know this is going to come off as bias. I always talk about on this channel how Nightwing, Dick Grayson, is my absolute favorite DC hero. And yes, that is absolutely right. However, even my bias aside, I did say if anyone had Wonder Woman in that number one spot, I would not argue with them. And I would absolutely understand why they put her in that spot. However, with all that being said, just to explain why I have Dick Grayson in this spot instead of Wonder Woman, Dick Grayson is the face of sidekicks. Dick Grayson is a part of the dynamic duo. So if you say Wonder Woman is part of the Trinity of DC, that is true. But what also can be true is Robin is part of the dynamic duo, arguably the most iconic duo in DC. More iconic than Superman and Batman. If you say Batman and to a lot of people, most of them will say Batman and Robin. They are the dynamic duo. They have had so many different iterations together, both in live action and animation, where they do appear as a team. However, that's not the only reason this character is my fourth Mount Rushmore spot. You see, not only is Dick Grayson the face of sidekicks and a person who propelled a ton of sidekicks into being very much so fan favorite characters, he also led the Teen Titans, one of the most popular superhero groups in all of comics, sometimes rivaling the likes of the Avengers, outselling the likes of the Guardians of the Galaxy. He is 95% of the time the leader of the Teen Titans. The only time he is not is when he either becomes Nightwing and leaves the team, or in stories in which he is slightly too young and they are just waiting until he gets a little older, and then he will take on the mantle of leader of the Titans, similar to how they did in the Young Justice series. However, even still, like they did in Young Justice, Dick Grayson is very much so the main character. He has the most important moments. He has the most important character interactions. And not only that, the character of Robin became such an important mantle that Batman has literally had so many Robins, it is hard to keep track. You have Dick Grayson, Jason Todd, Tim Drake, Damian Wayne, Stephanie Brown, Carrie Kelly, Matt McGinnis, and you can go on and on with how many characters take over the mantle of Robin, a mantle that was made so successful and so popular thanks to Dick Grayson. And I would argue that a lot more people have seen the animated cartoons about Teen Titans, Teen Titans Go, and Young Justice than have seen the Wonder Woman animated movies. And that's not to say that I enjoy one more than the other. As I said, the animated Wonder Woman movie is spectacular. I highly recommend it if you haven't seen it. However, I can't overstate how much the impact those shows had on the next generation of comic fans. So many people, even to this day, love the original Teen Titans series, so much so that a lot of people are hoping and praying it comes back. Not only that, we saw a revival of a Young Justice series, which once again had Dick Grayson at the forefront. And yes, he is Nightwing by that point, but it is still the same character of Dick Grayson who started out as Robin. So it is because of all of that that I personally have Dick Grayson as my number 4 spot on Mount Rushmore of superheroes. And even that being said, if you have Wonder Woman, please don't attack me in the comments, as I do genuinely agree with your take and I will never dispute it. I just feel like a lot of the arguments that you have for why Wonder Woman could be in that 4th spot, I also think translates to Dick Grayson, just because of what each of those two characters did for comics. One representing a whole generation of women, and one representing a whole generation of sidekicks that want to propel themselves into being actual heroes and not just afterthought sidekicks. But I'm interested to hear what all of you think. Do you agree with my list? If not, who would you put in that 4th spot on the Mount Rushmore of superheroes? Let me know in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And I'll see all of you in the next video. Goodbye.